In a medieval village, the day didn't begin with the gentle buzz of an alarm clock or the slow stretch of a quiet morning. It began with the sun, whether you were ready or not. Time was not kept in minutes and seconds, but in the shifting of light and the rhythm of necessity. As dawn crept across the horizon, villagers stirred, not because they were well rested, but because there was work to be done, animals to feed, and no real alternative. Most people in a medieval village slept in a single room home, often shared with their entire family, and more often than not, some of their livestock. Pigs might grunt in the corner. Chickens might rustle in a box near the fire. A goat might bleat softly before anyone else opened their eyes. Sleep happened in a communal pile, and sacks of straw or worn-down bedding made from hay, stuffed cloth, or simply wool laid directly on the wooden floor. Beds, in the way we think of them, were rare luxuries. You slept in the clothes you wore the day before, the week before, maybe even the month before. The air inside the house was thick and smoky, even in the early morning. That's because most homes didn't have chimneys. Instead, the fire pit smoldered in the center of the room, releasing smoke that wafted upward and slowly seeped through cracks in the roof. In winter, the smoke was a blessing. It helped warm the room and keep bugs away. But in every other season, it just meant sore throats and blackened beams. Your lungs grew up alongside the smoke, and no one questioned it. That was simply the air you breathed. You might imagine the iconic rooster crowing to wake the village. But in truth, they crowed whenever they pleased. Loud, unhelpful, and without any regard for human sleep, they were more of a nuisance than an alarm. More often, you woke to movement, the shifting of bodies, the first stirring of a pot over the fire, the creak of wooden planks under heavy feet. If a baby was crying or someone was already arguing about bread, then you knew the day had officially begun. There were no long, luxurious mornings. No time to stretch or reflect. Getting up meant starting chores immediately. The fire needed to be revived, and the embers poked to life. Someone had to fetch water from the village well, and depending on the season, that water might be icy or thick with mud. Water was carried in wooden buckets, which leaked, splashed, and soaked the hems of your already filthy clothes. Privacy was something you didn't think about, because you'd never known it. You changed clothes if you had more than one set right in front of your family. You bathed maybe once a week, if that, and only if there was time and enough water to go around. A good scrubbing was rare. Most of the time you wiped your face. With the damp cloth, ran your fingers through your hair, and called it good enough. Breakfast was whatever was left over from the night before. Cold porridge, if it hadn't been eaten by rats or gone sour. A piece of coarse, dark bread that had to be dipped in weak ale just to be chewable. On special days, maybe there was some cheese or a bit of onion or the last of the dried beans. From the winter stores, butter was a treat, and meat in the morning was almost unheard of unless someone had just slaughtered an animal, which was rare and usually reserved for religious festivals or times of desperation. You ate with your fingers. Or if your family was fortunate, with a shared wooden spoon. Plates were optional. Food was served in a common pot and everyone reached in together. Children often got the leftovers, and elders might eat last. Meals were about filling your stomach, not enjoying the flavor. Salt was expensive, and spices were exotic imports that never made it to villages like yours. You chewed slowly because the bread was dense and your jaw was already sore from the last meal outside. The village was coming to life. The narrow dirt paths between houses began to fill with sound-low voices, barking dogs, the rhythmic creak of cartwheels, and the clatter of wooden buckets. The air smelled of damp earth, animals, and smoke. In the distance, you might hear a blacksmith's hammer, a child crying, or someone shouting about missing hens. The homes were close together, usually built from timber, wattle, and daub. Roofs were thatched with straw, which leaked when it rained, and occasionally harbored rats or birds. If you were lucky, you had a small garden patch outside your door. If you were unlucky, your home was on a slope and filled with rainwater each spring. Either way, your home blended into the others, forming the tight, earthy cluster that made up your entire world. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from their village in their lifetime. The wider world was something you heard about through gossip, traveling monks, or the occasional tinker selling pots and knives. But your daily reality was bound to this patch of land, this group of people, this cycle of work and rest. The year was divided not by vacations or holidays, but by planting seasons, harvests, and feast days set by the church. Your thoughts in the morning were simple and immediate. Did the animals survive the night? Did the fire go out? Did the roof leak again? Would it rain? What needed mending? Who needed feeding? And what punishment would you get if you forgot to do something important? The rhythm of medieval life was unrelenting. From the moment you opened your eyes, you were already behind. There was no sleeping in, no morning tea, no quiet time to yourself. Just the dull ache of yesterday's labor, the faint hope of something better, and the knowledge that today would probably be just like the day before it dot. And so, with the sun barely above the horizon and the smell of burning wood filling your nose, you stepped outside into the mud, blinked against the brightness, and started the same hard day all over again. Your house was a damp wooden box shared with everyone if you lived in a medieval village. Your home was less of a sanctuary and more of a box that barely kept out the weather. It didn't have a name, a doorbell, or any form of insulation. It was made with whatever materials were nearby, mostly timber, wattle, and daub, and a whole lot of hope. Rain came in, cold settled deep into the walls, and wind snuck through every crack like an unwanted guest who never left. The structure itself was small, very small. Most peasant homes were a single room, one space to eat, sleep, work, argue, pray, raise children, and sometimes keep a pig. Some homes might have had a loft or a small divider made of cloth, but that was the extent of luxury. Space was not a feature, it was a challenge. The walls were constructed from wattle and daub, lattice of wooden sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. That combination helped to seal gaps, but not forever. It cracked over time. Insects burrowed in it. The rain wore it down. And in winter, it grew damp and cold. Mold was common, but there wasn't really a word for it. It was just the wall. The roof was typically thatched layers of straw tied together tightly and laid over wooden beams. It looked picturesque from a distance, but in practice, it required constant repair. Birds nested in it. Rats chewed holes through it. And heavy rain would drip through, turning the floor below into a slick, muddy mess. People joked about placing buckets under the leaks, but often there weren't enough buckets to catch all the water, or enough dry places to put them. There were no floorboards, no tiles. The floor was simply dirt, sometimes packed tightly, sometimes loosely, depending on the weather. During the dry season, it was dusty and hard. During rain, it turned to sludge. In winter, it froze. Sometimes straw or rushes were laid down to make it more comfortable or less disgusting, but those rushes collected food scraps, spilled ale, animal droppings, and whatever came in on your shoes. And they weren't replaced often. Only the very cleanest homes might refresh the rushes once a month. Most waited until they began to stink. Windows, if present at all, were just holes in the wall with a wooden shutter. There was no glass. Some wealthier peasants might have an oiled cloth stretched across the opening to let in a little light while keeping out some of the wind. But most just kept the shutter closed during storms and open during the day. In winter, letting in light meant letting in cold, and villagers had to choose between seeing what they were doing or not freezing. Inside, the furniture was as minimal as it could get. A table, maybe 2 benches, a few stools, some hooks or pegs on the wall for hanging, clothes and tools. There were no wardrobes or drawers. Clothing was stored in chests if you had one. Otherwise, it was folded in a pile or simply left on the floor. Utensils were shared. Bowls were often carved from wood, and pottery was rare and cherished. If you broke a pot, it was a small tragedy. At the heart of the room was the fire pit. It was the center of life. You cooked over it. You gathered around it. You relied on it for warmth, light, and protection from darkness. It was never allowed to go out completely, especially in winter. Embers were banked under ashes each night, and the first person to wake up had the job of blowing it back to life. Firewood had to be gathered constantly, and the smoke from the fire filled the room every day, clinging to walls, hair, clothing, and lungs. There was no chimney in most homes. The smoke drifted upward and escaped through holes in the roof or through the door when it was open. It blackened everything it touched. Your rafters were dark, your skin was gritty, and coughing was a normal part of the day. You didn't talk about air quality. You simply lived in a smoky haze. If you were fortunate enough to have a bed, it was shared. Parents might sleep in the same bed as their children. Siblings were bundled together under the same threadbare blanket. If you were really unlucky, you shared your bed with fleas, lice, or worse. Straw mattresses were common, and over time they got lumpy, damp, and home to small critters. Tinging the straw meant finding more, drying it, and stuffing it back inside a torn cloth casing. Most people did it only when they couldn't tolerate the smell anymore. Animals often lived indoors with the family. Chickens were kept in boxes, goats tied near the door, and pigs might sleep in a pen inside the home. This wasn't because villagers loved their animals. It was because livestock was valuable, and theft was a real concern. Also, the animals produced heat, and their body warmth made freezing nights just a little more bearable. But it also meant your home sounded like a barn and smelled like one, two dot. There was no running water. No indoor latrines. Chamber pots were used at night, but many people simply went outside when they needed to relieve themselves. Some homes had a compost heap behind them, but waste disposal was primitive at best. You did what you could, and you didn't complain too loudly, because everyone else was living in the same mess. Privacy, again, was non-existent. If someone was sick, everyone heard them. If a baby cried, everyone woke up. If a couple had a romantic moment, the rest of the family pretended very hard not to notice. Shame was present, but options were limited. Life was crowded, noisy, and utterly shared. Despite the dampness, the smoke, the dirt, the lack of space, and the general discomfort, people made it feel like home. You hung herbs from the beams. You patched the walls with care. You swept the floor with bundles of twigs and lit candles when you could afford them. You kept small icons or crosses on the wall, hoping for divine protection from sickness, storms, or bad luck. And if a neighbor came over, they didn't judge your home. It looked just like theirs. Maybe yours had fewer cracks. Maybe theirs had a better bench. But fundamentally, all homes in the village followed the same humble template. A roof that sometimes held. Walls that sometimes stood firm, and floors that were never truly dry. Your house was your shelter, your workspace, your kitchen, your bedroom, your nursery, and your stable. It didn't matter that it leaked, creaked, and smoked. It was yours. You'd built it with your own hands or inherited it from your father. And when the wind howled and the rain poured and the world outside turned to cold gray mud, you were grateful for every beam that held and every straw that stayed in the roof. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't clean. But it was home, morning. Meals in a medieval village were not something to look forward to. There was no scent of sizzling bacon in the air. No soft stack of pancakes or golden toast with butter melting on top. Instead, breakfast was a ritual of repetition and resignation. It was porridge, and not the creamy, cinnamon-sprinkled kind you might imagine. No, it was gray, bland, and frequently cold. Sometimes it wasn't even porridge at all, just yesterday's leftovers served in the same bowl, probably without being reheated. The concept of breakfast as a comforting start to the day didn't really exist for peasants. It was a practical matter, not a pleasurable one. After waking at dawn and enduring the early chores, rekindling the fire, collecting water, letting the animals out, or sweeping out yesterday's dust and ash, you were expected to eat something. That would keep you going through the long hours of labor ahead. But that didn't mean the food was nourishing, tasty, or even hot. Porridge, also called pottage when cooked more like a stew, was the go-to. It was made by boiling grains usually. Oats, barley, or sometimes rye water. Occasionally milk was used, but that was a rare treat, especially in winter when cows didn't produce as much. The grain was left to simmer until it thickened into a gluey paste. It wasn't salted unless you were fortunate enough to have salt, which was expensive. Spices were a fantasy. Sugar was unheard of in most villages. Honey could be used, but only if someone in your village kept bees or if a rare trade brought some in. For most, porridge tasted like soggy grain and warm boredom. More often than not, it wasn't even freshly made. The pot would sit overnight by the fire and be reheated the next day or not. Cold porridge was easier. It didn't require firewood, didn't demand your attention, and didn't use up what little energy you had. Sometimes it had hardened into a cake and was sliced into chunks. Other times it was scooped out with a wooden spoon, steaming faintly in winter. But in the summer, it might already be starting to sour. You didn't eat alone. Families shared breakfast from the same bowl or pot. Everyone gathered around the fire, dipping in their spoons, passing pieces of hard bread, or using crusts to scoop the slop. There was little conversation in the mornings. Most were still tired. Speaking was reserved for instruction, complaint, or silence. Children fidgeted, elders mumbled. The fire crackled. The only real sound was chewing. If bread was available, it would be dark, dense, and a few days old. Made from coarse rye or barley, the loaves were heavy and dry. The richer villagers might have access to wheat bread, which was whiter, softer, and finer, but only on holy days or during feasts. For everyone else, the bread was hard enough to be used as a tool. You soften it by soaking it in ale or water. Even then, you had to chew carefully to avoid breaking a tooth. Butter or cheese might be available, but in very small amounts. Butter was valuable and used sparingly. Cheese took time and skill to make, and it was usually saved for special meals or to barter with neighbors. Most often, you had to make do with whatever was left from dinner the night before. Maybe some beans, boiled greens, or an onion that hadn't gone soft. Leftover broth, if you were lucky, could be stirred into the porridge to give it some flavor. Ale was the drink of choice. Not because villagers were trying to get drunk before sunrise, but because water could be dangerous. Wells were often contaminated, streams were full of runoff and waste, and boiling water took time and fuel. Ale was mildly alcoholic, weak enough for children to drink, and strong enough to kill off some of the bacteria. It was safer than water, and besides it was filling. It gave you something in your stomach when food was scarce. On many days, breakfast wasn't a full meal. It was more of a moment, just a few bites before work. Many people waited until midday to eat a larger portion of food once the morning. Chores were out of the way, but skipping breakfast entirely wasn't wise. You needed something in your body before spending hours plowing, digging, spinning, or mending. Even if it was cold, tasteless, and gummy, it was fuel. Children didn't get their own portions. Food was served according to need, age, and strength. The father often ate first, then the eldest sons, then the mother, then the younger children. Babies might be given softened bits or warm milk if a goat was producing. But fairness wasn't the guiding rule, survival was. If there wasn't enough, someone went without. Cleanup was minimal. There were no sinks, no soap. You scraped out the bowl with your fingers or a piece of bread. You wiped the spoon on your tunic. You might rinse things with a little water from the well if it was nearby, or just set the bowl down until it was used again. Hygiene wasn't a major part of the meal experience. The fire pit crackled on, and the pot of porridge might stay there until the next meal. Some mornings were worse than others. In times of hunger, after a poor harvest, during a long winter, or when stores had run low, you might find nothing waiting for you. Perhaps a handful of dried peas, a raw turnip, a slice of stale bread so hard it hurt your teeth. Families sometimes thinned out porridge with more water to stretch it further, or simply went hungry. You got used to hunger. It was part of life, still. Breakfast was a ritual. It marked the start of the day. Even when there was no time and little food, it was something everyone did together. It was a moment of shared silence, grumbling, and habit, No one expected variety or excitement. No one hoped for surprises. You sat, you ate, and you braced yourself for the long hours ahead. And even though you'd eaten the same thing yesterday, and the day before that, and the week before that, you didn't complain because porridge, however bland, was better than nothing. The sun had barely risen. Your breakfast of cold porridge sat uneasily in your stomach, and already it was time to start working. In a medieval village, the morning was not a peaceful time of meditation, tea, or checking the weather for leisure. It was an immediate descent into routine. And the word routine here did not mean productivity hacks or clever scheduling. It meant chores. The kind of chores that never ended, never got easier, and never left you with a sense of accomplishment. The first and most urgent task was often fetching water. There was no running tap. No pump in your yard. Instead, water had to be drawn from the village well, or if you were less fortunate, from a muddy stream or spring further afield. The buckets were made of wood and iron and weighed a good deal even before they were filled. Carrying them back required strength and balance. Spill. Too much, and you'd have to turn right around and do it all over again. The path to the well was muddy more often than not. In dry seasons, it was caked and cracked. In winter, it was slick with ice. No one lined it with cobblestones. There was no maintenance. Just your feet, your bucket, and your best hope not to twist your ankle while slipping in something. A pig left behind. Once the water was brought back, it needed to be stored in large ceramic jugs, barrels, or troughs, if you had them. Otherwise, it stayed in the bucket, and everyone used it for everything. Washing your hands, watering the animals, boiling grain, rinsing your face, mopping the floor. It was all the same water. Clean and dirty were not separate categories, but points along a slow-moving spectrum. Meanwhile, animals had to be fed. Chickens squawked until they were let out of their coop, or more commonly, their box inside the house. Pigs grunted impatiently, waiting for their turn at the slop. Cows needed milking. Sheep needed herding. Goats needed both milking and herding, depending on your luck that day. Animals were vital to your survival, so caring for them was not optional. It was priority. Milking cows and goats was a skill passed down through repetition, not instruction. You learned how not to get kicked in the face. You figured out how to coax milk from a stubborn udder. You dealt with insects, cold fingers, and the smell. There was always a smell. The milk had to be stored somewhere cool or used quickly. There was no refrigeration. Spoilage was expected. Feeding the animals wasn't just about tossing food their way. You had to know what to give them, how much, and when. Too little, and they became weak. Too much, and you wasted resources. You might have to gather hay, chop root vegetables, or mix up a thick stew of kitchen scraps. Pigs would eat almost anything. Chickens were less picky. Cows required patience. Every creature had its rhythm, and you had to learn to move with them. Next came cleaning. There was always cleaning. Not the kind that left your home sparkling. The kind that tried to hold back the tide of filth. You swept the dirt floor with a bundle of stiff twigs. It never stayed clean. Not for a single hour. You tried to keep the straw in place, to gather ash from the fire pit, to shake crumbs from the table. Dust blew in through cracks in the wall. Mud clung to every shoe. Children dropped things constantly. Animals made messes in unexpected corners. You cleaned because not cleaning made things worse, not because it ever made things good. Clothing had to be mended. If a tunic tore, you stitched it. If a stocking unraveled, you reknit it. There were no new clothes waiting in a chest of drawers. Everything was reused, patched, and repaired. Needles were valuable tools. Thread was not wasted. Every woman and older child knew how to sew, whether they liked it or not. If they didn't, their sleeves would fall off and their socks would vanish. If you were married or had children, your chores multiplied. Children needed watching, feeding, scolding, dressing, and generally keeping alive. Toddlers wandered off. Infants cried endlessly. Older kids tried to get out of their own chores. You supervised while working yourself. multitasking in the most exhausting way possible. There were no cradles with soothing mobiles, no toys beyond sticks, stones, and whatever could be fashioned from old bits of wood. A quiet child was often a suspicious child. They were either asleep, ill, or in trouble. Then there were the tools. Always something to fix, sharpen, or locate. Scythes dulled quickly. Hose cracked. Wooden handles splintered. Iron was too expensive. To waste? If a tool broke, you didn't replace it, you repaired it. Or you borrowed from a neighbor and hoped they didn't ask for something in return. Sometimes you had to walk to the blacksmith's hut and wait your turn. And while waiting, you might be handed another task. Like helping someone dig a trench or haul a bag of grain. Gardens needed tending. Whether you grew onions, leeks, beans, or cabbages, something was always in need of weeding, watering, or saving. From pests, crows were ever present. Worms infested roots. Rain flooded furrows. And if nothing went wrong, the harvest still might be meager. You worked the soil with basic tools and a lot of guesswork. Some villagers had a good touch with plants. Others cursed it every season. Then there were errands. You might have to walk to the communal oven to bake your bread. You might trade eggs for flour or milk for fish. If the local manors officer called a gathering, you had to go. If the priest requested help with something at the church, you were expected to obey. Authority wasn't questioned. Refusing meant punishment or shame, and either one was a heavy burden in a small village dot, and in between every task was walking. So much walking. Up and down muddy lanes, back and forth to the well, across uneven paths to the pasture, or down to the edge of the woods to gather sticks for kindling. You walked in the sun and the rain and the cold, and sometimes all three in one day. Your boots, if you had any, wore down. Your legs ached by mid-morning. And yet, the work was just beginning. There were no weekends. No days off. Holy days meant more church, not less work. Chores didn't respect the calendar. Animals didn't take holidays. Water didn't carry itself. Every morning was a return to the same exhausting pattern. The tasks changed slightly. With the seasons, but their presence never wavered. The moment one job ended, another began. Even children had chores. Feeding the hens, scaring off birds from crops, collecting firewood, watching younger siblings. They were expected to contribute as soon as they could walk steadily. Childhood wasn't a protected phase. It was a countdown to adult responsibility. And yet, this rhythm of endless, repetitive labor formed the backbone of the village. It was predictable. It gave the day structure. You knew it needed doing. You knew who would be doing it. And even if you were tired, hungry, or aching, you got up and did the work anyway. Because there was no alternative dot in a medieval village, the morning chores were not just part of life. They were life, if there's one word that could sum up the average medieval villager's environment. It's dirt. It wasn't just under your feet. It was on your hands, in your hair, behind your ears, embedded in your clothes, baked into your skin, floating in your soup, and probably even in your dreams. Dirt wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was your constant companion, faithful, abundant, and utterly unavoidable. Let's start with the ground itself. The paths between homes weren't paved. There were no cobblestones unless you lived near a manor, and even then the stones didn't reach your doorway. What you had was earth packed tight in dry seasons, turned to sludge in rain, cracked open in the summer heat. When it rained, which it did often, the streets became a thick, soupy mixture of mud, manure, and refuse. Your shoes, if you had them, sank with every step. If you were barefoot, and many villagers were, you simply adapted to the squelch. Livestock wandered freely in and out of yards and paths. Pigs rooting around in the mud didn't care whose doorstep they stopped at. Chickens scratched at everything. Horses left behind puddles of unpleasantness that no one cleaned up. Waste ran in shallow. Ditches along the sides of homes, sometimes dug deeper to direct flow away from the center of the village, but not always successfully. There was no sanitation department, no scheduled cleanups. You dealt with filth by avoiding the biggest piles or by not looking down too carefully. Inside the house, things weren't much better. The floor was dirt, not covered in carpet, not tiled, not even laid with smooth wood. Just dirt, sometimes packed flat and sometimes uneven, depending on weather and where. Villagers spread straw or rushes over it to make it slightly more comfortable, but these quickly collected crumbs, spilled ale, bits of food, and every type of filth that could drift in through the open door. The rushes were supposed to be replaced regularly, but few had the time or inclination to do so. More often, the floor just got layered old straw pressed down beneath newer straw, a soft mattress of decay and grime. Ashes from the fire pit mixed with soot from the ceiling and drifted down over everything. There was no chimney in most peasant homes. The smoke from cooking and heating fires filled the single-room space, leaving a permanent haze. The beams overhead turned black with soot. Every surface had a fine gray coating. Your hands were never clean. No matter how many times you wiped them on your tunic, they went right back to the same color. Washing, as a concept, existed, but it was far from frequent. Water was heavy to carry and cold to use. Soap was a luxury made from animal fat and lye, and it was harsh on the skin. Bathing was often done communally, if at all, and more commonly. In the summer, when a trip to the river or stream was less likely to freeze your limbs. In winter, a basic rinse of the face and hands had to suffice. Dirt stuck in creases, beneath fingernails, in your ears, behind your knees. It became part of you. Clothing didn't help. Most villagers had one or two outfits total. These were made of coarse wool or linen, often undyed and difficult to clean. Clothes absorbed dirt like sponges and rarely saw proper washing. When they were washed, it meant soaking them in water and beating them with sticks near a riverbank. An exhausting task that could take an entire day and left you with frozen hands and stiff joints. Many villagers just shook their garments out, brushed off the worst of it, and carried on. Hair was a magnet for dust and ash. Women often kept it covered with wimples or kerchiefs, not for style, but to protect it from the filth in the air. Men wore hats or hoods for the same reason. Hair washing was rare, and lice were common. Combing helped, but only so much. Delousing was a regular chore, done by sitting in good light and picking the insects out one by one. It was tedious, unpleasant, and necessary. Even your food wasn't safe. Grains were often ground at communal mills, where stones could shed grit into the flour. Bread might contain bits of sand or even tiny pebbles. Vegetables came straight from the earth and were rinsed lightly, if at all. A little dirt in your stew was not something to complain about. It was part of the meal. If a worm made it into your cabbage, you were expected to pick it out, not make a fuss. Your bed, if you had one, was another dirt collector. A straw mattress wasn't airtight. Dust filtered in through the roof and walls and settled where you slept. Blankets and sheets were rarely washed, usually only when they became unbearable. Body sweat, soot, mud, and the dust from the fire turned every bed into a rustic ecosystem of its own. People sneezed often. Coughs were normal. Clean air was a luxury no one really believed in. Children played in the dirt. Babies crawled in it. Toddlers ate it, occasionally on purpose. It was everywhere, so avoiding it was impossible. No one worried too much unless it started making people sick, and even men, what could be done? You couldn't make the village cleaner. You just tried to keep the animals out of your food and the worst of the muck away from the hearth. The church sometimes preached about cleanliness, but even the priest lived in similar conditions. His robes might be finer, but the floor beneath him was just as muddy. Dirt was an equalizer. It didn't care if you were devout, hardworking, or lucky. It found you regardless. It clung to boots, to beards, to beds, to bread. You could curse. It sweep it, spit at it, but by the next morning it would be back. Rain made things worse. Everything turned to soup. Pigs wandered into your house to escape the downpour. The roof leaked. The air smelled of damp straw and mildew. Wood rotted faster. Tools rusted. You slipped while walking. You fell while hauling. You sank to your ankles trying to gather eggs. Dry spells weren't better. They brought dust, which settled over every surface and made your nose itch constantly. Over time, people stopped noticing. Dirt wasn't something to get rid of. It was something to live with. You adapted. You built your life around it. You didn't aim for spotless, you aimed for survivable. You wiped your face on your sleeve. You blew your nose in the corner of your tunic. You brushed the soot from your food and ate it anyway. In a medieval village. Dirt wasn't just a part of life, it was life. It shaped your days, coated your memories, and softened the edges of every object you touched. And whether you were trudging through muddy streets or lying in a dusty straw bed, you knew one thing for certain. You'd never, ever be clean. In a medieval village. The line between entertainment and surveillance was thinner than a poorly mended tunic. There was no theater, no radio, no books for the average peasant, and certainly no privacy. But there was gossip. Endless, tireless, all-knowing gossip. It wove itself through every muddy lane, fluttered through the air like chimney smoke, and settled in everyone's ears, whether they wanted it or not. Gossip was the heartbeat of the village, and sometimes its only form of news. Justice, or punishment. You didn't learn what was happening by reading a notice or checking a bulletin. You heard it, at the well, on your way to the fields, while you were brushing dirt off a potato. Gossip didn't need an invitation. It simply arrived, delivered on the hushed breath of a neighbor, or the too loud whisper of someone who wanted to be overheard. It came wrapped in half-truths, embroidered with exaggerations, and often confirmed by nothing at all. Who had been seen leaving the Reeves hut too late at night? Who was pregnant again? No one knew who the father was. Who didn't go to mass last week and had the gall to say they were too tired? Who stole a chicken, or accidentally let their goats trample someone else's turnips? There were always stories, and the village remembered them all. The village itself was small, and that made it tight. Most settlements had only a few dozen homes clustered together. You knew everyone, and they knew you. They knew your habits, your moods, your schedule. They knew when you argued with your spouse, when your child misbehaved, when your roof leaked again. The walls of your house were thin, and the gaps in the shutters were wide. There was no such thing as a private conversation, not really. Even the chickens probably listened. This constant awareness bred a peculiar kind of intimacy. You might resent your neighbor, but you knew the names of their children, how many teeth they had left, and that their pig had a limp. You might despise the old woman 2 doors down, but you also knew that she burned rosemary on Sundays, muttered when she walked, and was rumored to have been midwife to an uncountable number of births, including possibly yours. You couldn't escape these people. You shared meals, tools, fields, and sometimes even tragedies, and gossip was how you stitched yourselves into each other's stories. There were 2 speeds to village gossip, slow and deadly. The slow kind was harmless chatter, who was courting whom, who had grown a fine crop of cabbages, who got too drunk last feast day and fell into a ditch. These stories rolled along like a lazy river, soaking into everyone's daily conversation. They passed time, filled silences, and helped people feel connected. But the deadly kind, that was different. A whispered rumor could stain a reputation for life. Accusations, especially about moral failings, theft, or heresy, didn't require proof. If someone was suspected of something, even without evidence, the suspicion alone could isolate them. A widow might be accused of witchcraft simply for living alone and having too many cats. A man might be branded a thief because his tools looked too new. A young woman might be shunned for being seen talking to a priest. Too often, women bore the brunt of gossip's sharp edge. Their behavior was watched constantly. How they walked, how they dressed, who they spoke to, when they bled, and how often they visited the well. Gossip regulated them. It became a tool of discipline. A woman labeled loose might find herself without suitors. A mother deemed neglectful might be mocked or avoided. And because there was no legal defense against gossip, your only hope was to behave as invisibly as possible. Men weren't exempt, but the consequences tended to be different. A man accused of laziness might lose his place on the harvest team. One accused of stealing might face rough justice, a fistfight. a fine from the manor court, or being made to stand before the village to explain himself. Public humiliation was a common result of private chatter, and once the words were spoken, they couldn't be undone. Gossip had a long memory. Even children participated. They echoed what they heard at home, often with even less tact. If your family had argued over food the night before, don't be surprised if the entire village found out about it by midday. Children repeated everything. You learned to be cautious about what you said near them, and to avoid being too proud, too weird, or too loud in their presence. The church, of course, frowned on gossip. Priests preached against it, calling it sinful and divisive. But even they weren't immune. A priest who drank too much, flirted too openly, or misused the tithe box quickly became the subject of whispered stories. And sometimes he wasn't just the subject, he was the source. After all, confession was private. In theory, but in practice, the priest still had ears. And a tongue. Gossip also served as the unofficial law enforcement. There weren't police officers patrolling the village. Instead, wrongdoing was monitored through whispers. If you skipped work on the Lord's fields, if you overharvested your allotment, if you tried to barter unfairly, people talked. And if enough people talked, the reeve or the bailiff would hear about it. No one needed to file a formal complaint. The rumor mill did it for you. At the same time, gossip had its gentler side. It warned people. If someone's child was sick, neighbors spread the word and offered herbs. If someone's husband hadn't come home, others watched for him. If a bad wind was coming or the tax collector was spotted on the road, gossip moved faster than any. Chores. It was the village's emergency system, calendar, and weather report all rolled into one. There was even a performative aspect to it. People would gossip about gossipers. If someone was seen whispering too often, others began to whisper about what they were whispering. It became a recursive loop. You had to be careful, not just about what you did, but about what you appeared to be doing. Being talked about could be worse than being caught. And then, for all its dangers, gossip was ... fun. It was one of the few forms of amusement available. It filled the hours between milking and mending. It added flavor to the monotony of chores. Stories evolved, with each telling details exaggerated. Villains made crueler. Victims made more pitiful. A harmless spat could turn into a scandal by the end of the week. It was storytelling, performance, and catharsis. It let people express fears, hopes, and frustrations indirectly. It gave them power when they had little else. In a world where your life was dictated by the weather, the church, and the whims of your lord, gossip was a tool for managing uncertainty. If nothing else, it gave people something to talk about. So, as you walked the muddy paths of your village, carrying your bucket of water, you listened, you nodded. You pretended not to care, but you heard every word. Because even if you didn't join in, you knew one thing for certain. If you weren't the one talking, someone else was probably talking about you. In a medieval village. Nothing was ever quite fixed. Not fully, not properly, not for long. Whether it was your house, your tools, your shoes, or your back, everything was always just about working, and everyone was always just about coping. There was a quiet, almost heroic kind of acceptance to this constant state of semi-functional living. You didn't expect things to be in perfect condition. You expected them to be broken, and for you to find a way around it. Let's begin with your home, the roof. It leaked. Not all of the time, just enough to remind you that the last patch job wasn't quite right. Maybe it was a small drip that only showed up during a heavy storm, or a steady trickle that landed precisely on your sleeping spot. That needed constant attention. It sagged under snow, split in high winds, and was always being poked at by birds. You might throw another bundle of straw on top and hope gravity did the rest. Most people learn to place their bedding away from the worst spots, or to sleep lightly enough that the sound of dripping water would wake them in time to move. Your walls, they cracked. Wattle and daub looked charming only in paintings made centuries later. In real life, it crumbled, especially after winter frost or summer heat. You patched it with mud, straw, and if you were desperate, a bit of dung. These repairs were temporary by design. You weren't building for eternity. You were buying time. The door might hang crooked. The latch might stick. The shutters might fall off if the wind got too cheeky. And the floor, if you could even call it, that was a patchwork of packed earth, old rushes, and whatever dry bits you could find to scatter around. After a while, the unevenness became familiar. You knew where the dip was that collected water. You avoided the soft spot near the hearth. You learned to walk with an instinctive, cautious shuffle. Then there were your tools. Your hoe had a crack in the handle that you wrapped with twine months ago. The twine frayed, so you tied more twine over it. Your sickle's blade was dull, but sharpening it wore it down too fast, so you made do by cutting harder and hoping it held. Your wooden bucket leaked, so you angled it just right to avoid the worst of the dribble. Your shovel had a splinter that bit your palm every time you lifted it, but replacing it meant finding wood, carving a new handle, and praying it fit. No one had spare tools. If yours broke, you borrowed one. If your neighbor's was worse than yours, you tried to fix yours instead. If the blacksmith was too busy, you improvised. You hammered with stones, dug with sticks, patched with nails salvaged from old shoes. Everything in your life was a little bit bent, a little bit rusty, a little bit, don't touch that part or it'll fall apart. Even the clothing on your back was stitched and restitched. Tunics were handed down from sibling to sibling, patched at the elbows, reinforced at the knees. Socks were darned so many times they became more repair than fabric. Laces snapped and were tied together. Belts cracked and were knotted. You didn't throw things out, you adapted them until they couldn't physically hold together anymore. And then you cut them up to make something else. Dot shoes were a special kind of broken. Made from stiff leather or hide, they rarely fit well and often wore through. A hole in the sole meant a wet foot, but stuffing it with straw helped. You might line them with cloth scraps or try to harden them with grease. New shoes were expensive. They were given as gifts saved for festivals, or reserved for walking into town, never for slogging through mud to milk the cow. Even your furniture, what little of it you had, wasn't spared. The bench wobbled. The stool creaked. The table slanted slightly downhill because the floor was uneven, and one leg had been gnawed by something. Maybe a dog, maybe a child. You learned not to lean too far on one side. You got used to eating off tilted plates and watching cup slowly migrate toward the edge if you weren't paying attention. Of course, you didn't expect much more. No one around you had better. The Lord's manor might be stone instead of timber, but even that had its own kind of drafty misery. In your world, the concept of something being new was rare and almost unthinkable. The only things that were ever truly new were the ones you made with your own hands or babies, and even they arrived squalling and covered in grime. If something broke completely, you didn't panic. You sighed, you examined it, and you figured out how to keep going. If the water barrel cracked, you wrapped it with leather. If the cartwheel split, you drove with a limp until the carpenter had time. If the thatch fell in, you slept under a blanket and stared at the stars until you could fix it. Resilience wasn't optional. It was a lifestyle. Even your body, in a sense, was always slightly broken. Your back ached from lifting, your joints from kneeling, your hands from cold and repetition. Cuts became calluses. Bruises became memories. You learned to live with pain. You limped without comment. You got up every day and did the same labor, no matter how badly your shoulders protested or your fingers stiffened. A medieval villager didn't ask for comfort. They asked only that they could keep working. And while the brokenness of everything might sound miserable, and it often was, it also bred a humility. You didn't waste time aiming for perfection. You aimed for function. You didn't complain that your roof leaked. You were grateful it didn't collapse. You didn't fret that your pot had a crack. You used it anyway, gently, and found a way to make it last another season in a village where time moved slowly, seasons controlled. Your fate and every resource had to be stretched like linen on a loom. Nothing being fully fixed was just the natural state of things. You became an expert at improvising. You learned to squint past the flaws, and maybe, just maybe after a while, you stop seeing the cracks because in a medieval village, everything was slightly broken. People, tools, houses, hopes, but somehow life still carried on in the delicate and unbalanced world of a medieval village. One truth sat uncheckable at the center of everyone's life. No matter how hard you worked, how cleverly you saved, or how much the weather finally cooperated, the best of what you produced, your ripest grain, fattest pig, strongest son, or even your precious time would end up in the hands of the local lord. Not by theft, exactly, though it often felt like it. It was duty, obligation, the price of existing on land that was never truly yours. This wasn't a transaction you could opt out of. You didn't get to argue or negotiate. The feudal system wasn't a flexible arrangement, it was carved into the structure of society like grooves in a plow. You were a peasant, a serf, a villain, or perhaps even a cotter, depending on how finely the hierarchy was sliced in your region. The lord was the landholder, the master, and by both law and custom, the one who controlled not just the soil under your feet, but the rhythm of your entire existence. So every harvest season, when your family had spent weeks bent over in the field cutting wheat, hauling sheaves, and threshing the grain with aching arms, you knew what came next. The Lord's reeve would appear with his ledgers and his practiced scowl. His job was to make sure the Lord's share was taken first. And not just any share, the best of your yield. The golden, full heads of grain, the cleanest sacks, the properly dried bundles. What remained, the crooked stalks and shriveled kernels, were yours to keep if you were lucky. This process was called the domain duty or feudal dues, depending on how it was applied. Some peasants owed produce, others owed labor. Many owed both. There was boon work, which was compulsory labor during harvest or planting seasons. You'd be summoned, along with your neighbors, to tend the Lord's fields, often before your own. It didn't matter if your family was hungry or your own crops were wilting. The Lord's grain came first. Sometimes it wasn't grain. It might be pigs which you raised with great effort, feeding them scraps and guarding them from wolves. When the time came, you'd offer up your largest, healthiest animal, not out of generosity, but because you were expected to. Anything less might be seen as dishonest, even insulting. Or it was honey, wool, eggs, geese, or cheese. The Lord's manor wasn't a self-sustaining paradise. It relied on the village to supply it with all the best seasonal goods. And when the Lord or a steward visited, they didn't want sour ale or half-rotted onions. They wanted your finest. It was a quiet, unrelenting process of siphoning. The best cloth you wove. A portion of it went to the manor. The longest hours of your week spent on the Lord's roads, repairing his fences, cleaning his ditches. You might even be required to grind your grain at his mill, and adding insult to injury, pay him a fee for using it. You didn't get to choose where or how your work happened. The manor dictated the rhythm, and your needs followed afterward. If you ever thought of saving up or selling your excess, you quickly found that the taxes ate it away. Lords collected tallage, an arbitrary payment often demanded when the lord needed funds, say, to go to war, to pay for a marriage alliance, or simply because his income was less than expected. You had no say in it. The collection was just announced, and you paid sometimes with coins, sometimes in goods, and often in promises that you'd try to come up with something before next week. And when a member of your family died, you faced another cruel tradition, Harriet. This was a death duty owed to the Lord. You handed over your best animal or item, the very thing your household depended on most at precisely the moment you were weakest. Your spouse had died, and now your strongest ox had to go too. Even freedom was something the Lord held over you. If you wanted to move away, marry outside the village, or join the clergy. You needed the Lord's permission, sometimes in writing, sometimes accompanied by a fee. Your life, your choices, your future, they all flowed upward through the manor. Like your produce on collection day, of course, this system didn't always feel tyrannical. Some lords were relatively fair. They held feasts, protected the village from bandits, ensured the reeve didn't overreach. But even the kindest lord still took your best. The difference was whether he smiled when he did it. The feudal system, at its core, was designed to keep peasants producing, lords consuming, and everyone in their proper place. You learn not to get attached to your labor's results. That fat goose you raised in spring, gone by autumn. The crisp apples you picked with care, sent up to the manor. The cleanest fleece from your healthiest sheep, claimed for the Lord's use, perhaps to be spun into a cloak he'd wear once. And forget, you could curse under your breath, but never out loud. There were moments when resentment boiled. Bad harvests followed by the same demands. Sickness in the family and no relief from your duties. A reeve who got too greedy. A lord who threw lavish banquets while your children gnawed on crusts. But rebellion wasn't an option, not unless you were ready to face fines, prison, or worse. Instead, you sighed, you adjusted. You handed over your best and hoped next year might be lighter. Even in death, the village remembered. He gave the Lord his best ox and still lost his house. She spun wool all winter and never saw a coin. The stories circulated, warnings wrapped in memory. They reminded everyone the system didn't reward generosity. It simply expected it. And so year after year you planted, raised, harvested, and built. And every year your best efforts were lifted out of your hands before you could taste them. Not because you wanted to give, but because you had no choice. In a medieval village. Your best was never truly yours. In a medieval village. Fatigue wasn't a symptom. It was a permanent state of being. Everyone was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes after a bad night's sleep or a long day at work. It was the deep marrow-level tiredness that settled in early and never left. You were tired at dawn, tired at dusk, tired when you laughed, tired when you wept, tired when you had nothing left to do but sit in silence and feel your bones. And the strange thing was, no one thought this was unusual. Being tired wasn't something to complain about, it was simply what life was. You woke up tired. That was your baseline. Your bed, if you had one, was a sack of straw, possibly shared. With a spouse, a child, or three. The straw might be fresh in the spring, but by autumn it was full of bugs, dust, and smells you tried not to think about. If the roof leaked, the straw was damp. If it was winter, your breath clouded the air as you shivered awake. If it was summer, the inside of the house was hot and thick with the scent of sweat and livestock. Sleep came in short bursts, often interrupted by noise, cold, or your own aching joints. There were no blackout curtains, no feather pillows, no alarm clocks. The sun was your signal, and it never waited. Chickens stirred. Dogs barked. A rooster crowed somewhere nearby. No, sometimes far too early. And so, before the light had fully warmed the floor, you were already moving because there were always chores. And the chores didn't care how you felt. Fetching water, feeding animals, making fire, preparing whatever food could be scrounged. It all came first. No one else was going to do it. There was no team, no rotation, no self-care day. Even children contributed. As soon as they could walk, they carried things, fetched things, watched younger siblings. Everyone worked. And everyone, young and old, was tired. The work was physical. It demanded your entire body, all the time. You dug in the dirt, lifted heavy sacks, scrubbed clothes against the river rock, chopped wood, turned soil with crude tools, bent over to weed, reached to patch a roof. You knelt to pray, stood in long lines at the bakehouse, sat on hard benches, and walked everywhere. The village wasn't large, but the distance between here and done was always just out of reach, and there were no ergonomic tools. No cushion. Handles were soft grips. A plow handle blistered your palms. A washboard bruised your wrists. A water bucket bit into your shoulder. Your knees cracked from crouching. Your hips ached from standing. You didn't stretch, you kept going. Food, when you had it, didn't fix things. It filled your belly, but it rarely nourished in the way we might understand today. You ate mostly grains, boiled vegetables, and occasional bits of cheese or dried meat. The bread was coarse. The stew was thin. The flavor was secondary to the calories. You ate to keep going, not to feel refreshed. And sometimes you didn't eat enough. That harvest, no meat this winter. Livestock sickened, no milk. You went to bed hungry and woke up weak, but still went to the fields anyway. Sleep was rarely deep. There was too much to think about. Would the sheep wander off again? Would it rain and ruin the barley? Would the baby make it through the night without fever? You didn't lie awake because of existential dread. You lay awake because you were listening for animals, for thieves, for crying, for storms, for danger. Illness didn't mean rest. Unless you were truly too weak to stand, you still had to work. A cough? Carry on. A fever? Wear an extra layer and stay close to the fire. Pain was ignored until it couldn't be. There was no medical leave, no healing spa. If someone was injured, they sat and stitched. If they could stir a pot or chase a goose, they were considered well enough. Rest was for the dying, and even when you did have a slow day, it wasn't restful. Maybe it rained too hard to plow, or a festival delayed work. But then you'd be repairing clothing, sharpening tools, patching the fence, delousing your kids, fixing the roof, tending to the sick. A slower pace, perhaps, but not a break. Being tired wasn't viewed as a problem. It was a badge of normalcy. If you weren't tired, people wondered what you weren't doing. And the tiredness wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional. You carried the weight of survival on your shoulders every day. The fear of famine, the ache of grief, the worry over taxes, illness, feudal dues. It wore down your spirit just as much as your knees. Older villagers carried their tiredness like cloaks. You could see it in the way they stooped, the way they winced when standing up, the way they moved slower and slower each season. But they didn't stop. Stopping wasn't part of the design. You worked until your body said no, and even then, you probably kept going. There was no retirement. Number? Golden years. No reward for a lifetime of labor besides the hope that your children might survive long enough to start their own tired journey. Despite this constant fatigue, life continued. People laughed, sang, danced at festivals. They fell in love. They found joy in small things, a warm fire, a good loaf, a moment of peace. But even those were brief intermissions. You'd smile and then get back to work. There were no sleep remedies. No beds with memory foam. You didn't journal your feelings or do breathing exercises. You collapsed into the same spot each night, on the same worn bedding, under the same patched roof, and listened to the familiar creaks of wood and snuffles, of animals before drifting off, not because you were relaxed, but because your body simply gave out. And in the morning, the cycle began. Dot in a medieval village. Tired wasn't something you escaped. It was the background music to everything you did. It was the price of life. And somehow, through all the aches and exhaustion, people endured, because that's what they knew how to do. Dot in a medieval village. Religion wasn't just something you believed, it was something that believed in you, followed you around, and dictated almost every aspect of your existence, whether you wanted it to. It was the clock on your wall, the judge in your thoughts, and the calendar on your table, except you didn't have a clock, a judge, or a table. You had the church bell, the priest, and an endless rotation of saints' days to remind you that your soul, your chores, and your free time all belonged to something much higher. Religion shaped your schedule before you were even fully awake. The first sound you heard in the morning might have been the crowing rooster, but right after that came the church bell. It rang out to mark the hours of prayer, not for you personally, but for the monks or nuns living in the larger monastery. Down the road, still, you heard it and you knew what it meant. Another day had begun under God's eye. You attended Mass regularly, usually on Sundays and feast days. For some villages, this was the only formal gathering space, a place where people of all classes came together, knelt in the same cramped pews, if pews even existed, and muttered the same Latin phrases most of them didn't fully understand. The priest did the speaking. You did the nodding and kneeling and crossing yourself. You probably didn't know exactly what Agnus Dei meant, but you said it when everyone else did. But church wasn't just for Sunday. Religion ran through the week in more subtle, constant ways. Every chore, every action began and ended with small gestures of piety. You crossed yourself before meals, whispered prayers during storms, muttered invocations when someone sneezed or got injured. Births, deaths, marriages, illness, all passed through the church's hands. The priest kept track of who had confessed and who hadn't, who was living in sin, who was overdue for penance. Your soul was under surveillance, Dot, and then there were feast days. So many feast days. The church calendar was crowded with saints, each with their own special day, sometimes two. These were meant to be breaks from work, days of celebration, and worship, but they were also complicated. Some required fasting, others involved rituals or processions. Sometimes the rules changed depending on who your local bishop was. You might find yourself in the middle of a fast you didn't fully understand, eating fish when you wanted meat, or attending a long sermon when you'd rather be mending your thatch. Lent was a particularly grim stretch. 40 days of limited meals, no meat, and constant reminders of sin and sacrifice. For a peasant already scraping by on gruel and turnips, being told to eat less for spiritual reasons was ironic. But you did it anyway, because not doing it meant judgment. Not just from God, but from your neighbors, who would surely notice that religion also controlled your fears. You weren't just afraid of wolves, or famine, or the tax man. You were afraid of hell, and not in an abstract way. The medieval imagination was rich with terrifying images of eternal punishment boiling. Cauldrons burning demons, endless screaming. Priests described it in vivid detail during sermons. Paintings on the church walls showed sinners being devoured by beasts or dragged into fiery pits. You didn't just fear death. You feared dying badly without confession, without absolution. Without a candle at your bedside, every bad thing that happened, a failed crop, a sick child, a barn fire could be interpreted as divine punishment. Maybe you skipped Mass last month. Maybe you took the Lord's name in vain. Maybe you stole a turnip when you were hungry. And now the Lord was displeased. It was terrifying because it was unknowable. You tried to live a good life, but you were never quite sure if it was enough and sin. It was everywhere. Pride, envy, gluttony, sloth, lust, anger, greed. There was always something to confess. Even thoughts could condemn you. The priest might be gentle or he might be strict. Either way, penance was required. That could mean fasting, prayer, giving up something valuable, or even public humiliation. You didn't get to walk away with a clean slate. You walked away slightly less dirty. Your free time, such as it was also shaped by religion. You didn't dance just because it was fun. You danced on saints' days. You didn't feast whenever you had food. You feasted when the calendar said you could. You didn't name your child after your favorite uncle. You named him after a saint whose feast day was near the birth. Your entire social rhythm followed the pulse of the church. Pilgrimages for those who could afford to leave were a religious vacation of sorts. You walked to distant shrines, prayed at holy relics, and hoped for miracles. For some, it was penance. For others, a chance to escape. But even that escape was soaked in prayer and reverence. You carried tokens, lit candles, and brought back stories of holy wells and healing bones. Even your language reflected your beliefs. You swore by saints. You thanked God for a good harvest. You cursed someone with God's judgment. Time was measured in prayers, a pater noster long, and oaths were binding only if sworn before the church. Religion wasn't separate. From daily life, it was daily life, filtered into every gesture and thought. And if you ever doubted, you kept it to yourself. Open heresy was dangerous. Questioning the church could get you excommunicated or worse. There were story whispers of people burned at the stake or sent away or made to kneel barefoot through entire services. The church had power, real, visible, terrifying power. So even if your faith wavered, Your behavior, D-I-D, single quotes, T-dot, of course. Not everyone was deeply devout. Some villagers went through the motions. Some priests were corrupt, lazy, or more interested in wine and souls, but the system endured because it offered structure, purpose, and hope. For people who had so little control over their lives, the idea that suffering had meaning, that this world was hard, but the next one would be better, was comforting. It helped you endure the mud, the hunger, the gossip, the fatigue. Religion ruled you, not just with fear, but with ritual, rhythm, and a sense of belonging. It gave you a place in the world and a way to make sense of your troubles. It watched over your work, your rest, your sins, and your salvation. And as the church bell rang again in the cool dusk air, you crossed yourself, looked at the gray sky, and whispered the same thing your ancestors had whispered for generations. God, willing, tomorrow will be easier. In a medieval village, romance wasn't a grand affair of roses, serenades, and moonlit strolls. There were no love letters sealed with wax, no candlelit dinners, and certainly no running away for forbidden passion. Love, when it came, was mostly practical, rooted in livestock, land, labor, and lineage. You might fall in love, yes. You might even marry for love, occasionally. But more often than not, your romantic fate was decided by the needs of your family, your social rank, and your ability to carry water and milk goats without complaint. Marriage wasn't a personal journey. It was a transaction, a negotiation, and a long-term survival plan. And it usually began very early by the time you were 12 or 13. People started noticing. Noticing how strong your arms were, how wide your hips were becoming, how many sheep your family owned. You were still a child in many ways, but childhood in the modern sense didn't really exist. If you could hold a hoe or keep a baby quiet, you were considered ready for adult responsibilities, including marriage. Parents looked to marry their children off strategically. A union wasn't just about creating a new household, it was about strengthening old ones. If your family needed help with farming, they might seek a spouse for you who came with strong siblings or useful tools. If your family had debt, they might aim for a marriage that included a dowry, however modest. If there was land involved, even just a strip near the edge of the commons, things became even more serious. Land meant food. Land meant status. And marriage was how land passed hands, linked families, and occasionally sparked feuds. Love didn't always have much to do with it. That's not to say affection didn't grow. Many medieval couples did form strong, lasting bonds. They laughed together, shared burdens, raised children, and whispered in the dark after long days in the fields. But it often started from necessity, not desire. You married the girl whose family lived nearby, the boy who had a bit of pasture, the widow who still had a functioning cottage. Emotions were secondary to logistics. Proposals weren't elaborate. There were no rings, no kneeling, no orchestrated moments. It might begin with a conversation between parents, a quiet agreement during Lent, or a shared glance at the harvest feast followed by whispered questions. Once an arrangement was considered, there might be a betrothal, a public promise to marry, often sealed with a handshake or a symbolic gift. Sometimes it was as simple as giving bread and salt. The church insisted that marriages required consent, but in practice, pressure was common. A young girl might be told she would marry the widower down the lane. A boy might be warned that if he didn't wed the miller's daughter, he'd never get help with plowing again. And in a world where saying no to your family could mean isolation, starvation, or worse, most people went along with what was arranged. Weddings themselves varied depending on wealth and season. A village wedding wasn't a lavish celebration. It was a practical event. The ceremony usually took place outside the church, not in it. The priest would bless the couple at the entrance, say the required prayers, and the couple would publicly exchange their consent. The whole thing might take 15 minutes. Afterward, there might be food if the harvest had been good, if there was ale to spare, and if no one else was too sick to cook. Neighbors brought whatever they could: bread, cheese, salted fish. Few coins were tossed into the bride's lap. Someone played a fiddle. There might be dancing. There might be laughter. And then the couple went home not to a honeymoon, but to a shared roof where new chores awaited. Expectations were immediate. A wife was expected to manage the household: cooking, mending, children, tending animals, weaving, fetching water, and everything else in between. A husband was expected to provide through farming, bartering, carpentry, blacksmithing, or whatever labor he could offer. There were no romantic getaways. There were no leisurely mornings. From the first day, it was about making it work. And if it didn't work, well, you stayed anyway. Divorce didn't exist in the way it does today. Annulments were rare and required church approval, and a reason like "we're incompatible" didn't count. You were bound legally and spiritually. Even in abusive or miserable marriages, escape was almost impossible unless death intervened. Widowhood was common, and remarriage wasn't seen as scandalous. In fact, it was often expected. A man with children needed a woman to manage the home. A woman without a husband needed protection and support. Some people married 3 or 4 times over. The course of a life, depending on how often plague, accident, or childbirth took a spouse. Grief was real, but survival was more pressing. Romance, when it appeared, often came in small forms: a gesture during milking, a smile across the market stall, a hand offered after a fall. There were moments of tenderness, moments when someone sang a love ballad by the fire, moments when a couple stole a kiss in the barn when no one was looking. But those were stolen seconds, not the focus of a relationship. The church also had opinions about sex and love. It encouraged marital intimacy, but only in moderation. Too much passion was seen as suspicious. Lust, even within marriage, was frowned upon. Every act was supposed to be for procreation, not pleasure. And yet, humans are humans. They found joy, warmth, and connection in the private corners of their shared lives. Even if they didn't talk about it much. And what of unwed love? It existed, of course. Young couples sneaking off into the woods, secret affairs. Rumors and scandals. A girl returning from pilgrimage a little rounder than she left. The consequences were harsh. A child out of wedlock could mean social ruin. The church demanded penance. The village gossip. Sometimes the couple was forced to marry in haste. Sometimes the woman was left to raise the child alone. But even amid the judgment, people kept falling in love or something like it. Because in the hard, weary world of medieval village life, companionship was one of the few comforts available. A warm body beside you, someone to share the work, someone who knew the rhythms of your day. That counted for something, and sometimes, just sometimes, 2 people married because they genuinely wanted to. They laughed more than they argued. They worked side by side. They mourned their losses together and celebrated their few victories with quiet smiles. There was love, not the poetic kind, but the steady, enduring kind. A kind forged through shared labor, shared grief, and the slow, unglamorous triumph of simply surviving another season together. Because in the medieval village, love wasn't a storybook fantasy. It was a roof patched together with good intentions, a bowl of stew shared after a long day, and someone who noticed when you were too tired to speak in a medieval village. Childhood was not a gentle, golden chapter of life. There were no toy chests overflowing, no school backpacks, no story time cuddled in blankets while firelight flickered on the walls. Childhood was short, brutal, and uncertain, so much so that no one really expected you to survive it. And if you did, you were expected to start acting like an adult almost as soon as you could stand upright and carry a bucket. Being born at all was already a gamble. There were no antiseptics, no skilled doctors in clean gowns, no sterile tools. Birth happened at home, usually on a straw-covered floor, with the help of a midwife and an experienced village woman who knew how to assist, soothe, and pray. But even the best midwife couldn't save a baby from breech position, umbilical strangulation, or infection. The mother, too, might die. Many women bore 10 children or more and buried half. If you survived birth, congratulations, but your troubles had only just begun. In your earliest years, you lived under constant threat. Illness was always nearby. Fever, morms, pox, diarrhea, and coughs that never quite went away. Even teething could become fatal if it caused swelling and infection. Infants were often wrapped tightly in cloth bands, swaddling to keep them warm and protected, but also to restrain them, since there was a belief that too much movement was dangerous or damaging. There were no vaccinations, no antibiotics, no clean water. Milk might be from your mother, or if she was too weak or had died, from a wet nurse or watered down goat's milk. Weaning was a risky period. Many infants died, not from hunger, but from poor substitutes, contaminated spoons, or diarrhea alone was a death sentence for countless little ones. If you reached the age of 5, people began to relax slightly. You were no longer an infant, and that alone was worth quiet celebration. But now you were expected to contribute. There was no schooling for most peasant children, no leisurely mornings spent drawing or playing. Boys began to help in the fields, scaring birds from crops or gathering kindling. Girls learned to spin, cook, carry water, and tend to younger siblings. A 6-year-old might already be changing swaddling cloths or herding geese. Clothing was. Miniature adult wear often hand-me-downs from older siblings or patched rags cut to size. No bright colors or animal-themed tunics. No soft fabrics stitched with care. Just whatever could be spared. You didn't have your own room. You likely shared a sleeping area with siblings, parents, or even livestock. Privacy was not a concept. You understood. Children's games existed, but they were simple stones, bits of wood, maybe a ball made from rags. Playing wasn't discouraged, but it wasn't scheduled either. There were no hours set aside for it. You played while waiting for bread to bake, or while walking behind your parents, or while watching animals in the fields. Laughter was common, but brief. Because at any moment, the world could turn cruel again. Injury and illness were constant companions. A small cut could become infected. A fall could mean a broken limb that never healed properly. Burns, bites, splinters, all serious threats in a world without medicine. And there was no such thing as pediatric care. If the priest couldn't pray it away, or your mother couldn't draw it out with herbs, you simply endured, or death hovered close. Families didn't name their children right away. Sometimes infants were only called the baby until they reached a certain age. Why give a name to someone you might bury next week? Graveyards were filled with tiny markers, or none at all. The church recorded baptisms and burials in the same breath. A child could be playing one morning, and gone by sunset. Sickness swept through villages like fire, and children were often the first to succumb. And yet, life had to go on. Parents grieved, but there wasn't time for long mourning. A dead child meant another mouth you didn't have to feed, an unthinkable thought now, but one that flickered quietly in the backs of tired minds then. You loved your children, but you loved them with caution, holding back some small part of your heart in case they disappeared. Those who survived into their teens were effectively adults. Boys took on full workloads in the fields or trades. Girls might be married by 14, or already managing households and bearing their own children. There was no adolescence, no teenage rebellion, no gap years. Just a slow slide from toddler to laborer, from child to parent, all within the same village, the same cottage, the same rhythm. Even in their short lives, children were expected to be pious. They were taught to fear sin, to kneel during prayer, to avoid speaking out of turn. The church warned that even children were not free from temptation. Naughty behavior was not a stage. It was seen as rebellion against order and morality. A willful child could be punished, even harshly. Corporal discipline was common and accepted. You learned quickly. Be quiet, be useful, be obedient. But not everything was bleak. There was warmth, too. Mothers whispered songs while stirring pots. Fathers carved small toys from scrap wood when time allowed. Siblings shared secrets in the barn. The village did what it could to protect its young, even knowing how fragile they were. People smiled when children laughed. They watched in awe when a toddler took their first steps. A surviving child was a kind of miracle, a hope. And if you were one of the lucky few who grew tall, strong, and clever, you might escape the worst of the cycle. You might be apprenticed. You might become a priest or a scribe or even rise to steward in the Lord's hall. But for most, survival just meant more work, more seasons, more repetition. Childhood was never about wonder. It was about becoming useful before the world snatched you away. In a medieval village. Children were not protected, they were prepared for a life that was hard, short, and relentless. And even though they were small and soft and full of questions, they carried burdens from the very beginning. They laughed, yes, but they also worked, feared, and too often vanished. In a medieval village. Reputation wasn't just a matter of pride, it was your currency, your defense, and often your only form of insurance. You didn't have credit cards or legal protection, no ID numbers or reputation scores. What you had was your name and what people whispered about it when your back was turned. It could elevate you, isolate you, or quietly destroy you. Reputation was everything, and gossip, quiet, relentless gossip, was the bloodstream of village life. Everyone knew everything about everyone else. Thatch walls were thin, windows were small, and privacy was an illusion. If your husband came home drunk, people noticed. If your goose went missing and then appeared on your neighbor's table, the next day, people noticed. If you spent too much time speaking to someone else's spouse, if your daughter came back from the pilgrimage with a suspicious glow, if you skipped Sunday Mass because of a headache, people noticed. And once noticed, they talked gossip. In a medieval village wasn't idle entertainment, it was a deeply embedded system of social regulation. There were no police patrols, no cameras, no digital trails. Instead, there were watchful eyes, tuned ears, and well-practiced tongues. Word of mouth was how the community enforced its norms, and the pressure to conform was constant. No law needed. To be passed to make someone feel punished, shame did the work. For most villagers, maintaining a respectable image was a daily task. You didn't need to be liked, but you needed to be known for the right things. Steadiness, clean living, fair dealings, going to mass, working hard, keeping your temper, avoiding scandal. If your name was associated with decency, you had a shield. Neighbors defended you. The priest spoke kindly of you. You were included in feasts, helped during illness, remembered during good harvests. But one slip, one rumor, and it all started to fray. A woman's reputation, in particular, was like fragile pottery once cracked. It never quite held water. Again, too outspoken, she's difficult, too reserved. She's hiding something, seen alone with a man, not her husband. She's impure, married too late, unwanted, married too early, questionable. If her child died, people asked if she'd made an enemy of God. If her husband died, people whispered about poison, even if they'd seen him drop from exhaustion themselves. A man's reputation was more forgiving, but still vulnerable. Lazy, unreliable, stingy, untrustworthy. Too wealthy, he's probably cheating the tithes. Too poor, must be cursed. If you lost your temper, you were unstable. If you avoided the alehouse, you were either holy or strange. Being different was always risky. Standing out, even slightly, invited stories. And once a story took root, it grew legs that it might start with a small truth. You argued loudly with your wife. But by the end of the week, people say you hit her. By month's end, they say she ran off to escape you. By harvest time, your new neighbor won't meet your eyes. No one corrects the story. Why would they? It's more fun this way. It binds them together to share, to judge, to know. And you're left to carry the consequences, whether or not they're deserved. But gossip wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it protected. If a man was known to be violent, word spread fast. Women avoided him. other men watched him. If a family was struggling, stories might drift toward the church, where someone discreetly arranged a donation. If a child was born weak, people said the right prayers. They remembered who had buried 4 children already. They brought food. They whispered yes, but with compassion. Gossip was also survival for those with no formal power. Peasant women, in particular, wielded information like a tool. They shared warnings, secrets, suspicions. They noted who got sick after eating which herbs, who gave birth early, whose field grew poorly after an argument with the reeve. It wasn't scientific, but it was useful. Oral tradition wasn't just folklore, it was a way of transmitting. Warnings, customs, and village justice dot. At the heart of this system sat the village network. Unofficial, invisible, but always humming. The alewife who heard confessions after a few mugs. The shepherd who noticed who left early from the manor feast. The baker who saw what coin you used or didn't. The priest boy who listened at doors. Every person was a node in the network. Every conversation was a thread, and you played the game too. You might deny it, but you listened. You smiled too long at one story, frowned at another. You repeated things just in case. You asked questions not for answers, but to see reactions. You gauged silence. You tracked who defended whom, who laughed first, who said nothing at all. Gossip, after all, wasn't about the story, it was about positioning dot to stay in favor. You had to contribute. Silence was suspicious, so you shared a little. Not the worst things, those were held back for dramatic effect, but enough to seem informed. Enough to be included dot, and then there were the long memories. Reputation didn't reset each year. If your grandfather was accused of theft, people still brought it up in hushed tones. If your aunt danced too freely at the solstice, it shadowed the whole family. You inherited not just land and tools, but whispers dot if things went truly sour. Gossip became punishment. Social exclusion. No one helped patch your roof. No one came to your feast. Your children were teased. You stood alone at Mass. You were present, but invisible. In a tiny village where cooperation meant survival, isolation could ruin you faster than a bad harvest. But if you played it right, kept your voice measured, your conduct clean, your ears open, you could rise in esteem. Be known as trustworthy. Be offered help before you asked. Be chosen as godparent, witness, or reeve. Reputation opened doors, earned favors, and softened hardships. And so every villager lived with this unspoken awareness that the people around them were always watching, always listening, always remembering. They might smile at you today, but they'd remember what you said, what you did, what you didn't, because in a medieval village, gossip wasn't idle. It was survival. And reputation wasn't something you owned. It was something you rented, renewed, daily by your behavior and paid for in whispers dot in a medieval village. The passage of time didn't feel like a straight road leading into the future. It felt like a worn, rutted circle. Year after year, the same work returned. The same tasks, the same problems, the same hopes. There was no grand sense of progress or ambition. You didn't climb a ladder or forge a destiny. You simply moved around the same seasonal wheel, again and again, until your body gave out and the cycle rolled on without you. The calendar, if you even knew it, wasn't divided by months in your mind. It was split by tasks. Planting time, lambing time, harvest time, tilling time, fallow time. Each phase came with its own rhythm, its own chores, and its own familiar difficulties. And every year, just as you finished one set of labors, another rose to take its place. Spring brought mud, mess, and motion. The thaw turned roads into thick, sucking sludge. Your boots filled with water. Your thatch dripped into your sleeping area. But the world also woke up. Seeds had to be planted. Fields cleared. Tools mended. Fences patched. It was exhausting work, but hopeful. The first green shoots poking up through the soil promised food to come, if the weather cooperated, if the pests stayed away, if the saints were kind. Summer was no lazy affair. It was long days of sunlight and sweat, weeding, tending, hauling water when the wells ran low, keeping animals from trampling the crops, watching the skies for hailstorms. That could undo months of effort in minutes. You might go to bed with sore feet, sunburned arms, and hands stained with dirt, but you kept going. Everyone did. Because the village needed food, and the fields didn't forgive laziness. Autumn was the climax harvest season. Every able body worked. Children, elders, neighbors, even the sick. Everyone had a role. Scything wheat, gathering apples, digging root vegetables. The pace was frantic because the window was short. Miss the harvest and you might starve. And once the food was in, it had to be processed, threshed, winnowed, salted, dried, stored. There was no celebration until the work was done. Only then came feasts, fairs, weddings, and a brief exhale. Winter was still cold and dangerous. The earth slept under snow or hardened mud. So did you, in a way. Not truly resting, but shifting your labor indoors, spinning wool, mending tools, repairing clothing, feeding animals from what little was stored. Firewood was precious, food was rationed. Nights were long, days short, and spirits often low. Illness struck hardest now. And yet, the year's wheel was turning. Midwinter festivals tried to lift hearts. You waited for the sun to rise earlier again. You endured. This cycle shaped not just your chores, but your sense of time itself. You didn't ask what day it was, you asked whether the barley was high yet. You didn't celebrate your birthday, you measured your life in how many harvests had passed. Since your first tooth fell out, everything moved in circles. Nothing truly changed. The same fields, the same paths, the same aches in your shoulders as you leaned over another row of vegetables. Even the festivals repeated. Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, Christmas. You looked forward to them not because they were new, but because they were known. Comforting in their predictability. Markers that you were still here, still surviving, and the tools you used changed little. The same wooden plows, the same woven baskets, the same water bucket with the same leak, patched for the third time. You didn't crave novelty. You craved reliability. A boot that held together for another month. A roof that didn't collapse under snow. A cartwheel that didn't shatter on the road to market thought. There were no vacations, no years off, no sabbaticals. If you were lucky, you might be excused from work on a saint's day, but even then, you might have to help cook for the feast or walk miles to attend mass. Your body was always moving. Your hands always doing. There was no end to the work. Only pauses. Children learn this cycle early. A toddler might toddle after their mother into the garden, mimicking her hoeing. A young boy might follow his father to the field, learning how to judge the soil. By the time they could speak fluently, they already knew the names of plants, the smell of rot, the timing of planting and reaping. Education wasn't about books, it was about routines. Muscle, memory, repetition. Old people, too, lived by the circle. Even if they couldn't swing a scythe anymore, they mended sacks, scared birds from the field, or told stories while spinning wool. Everyone had a place in the wheel, even if that place was slower, quieter. You didn't question this. Not because you were brainwashed or unaware, but because it was life. The land fed you if you respected its cycle. The church blessed you if you followed its rhythm. Your family relied on you to keep the circle moving. There was no time for existential crisis. You were too busy hauling water or salting fish. Even death fit into the pattern. People died in winter more often than in spring. Babies were conceived after harvest feasts and born in early summer. Funerals followed familiar prayers. Graves were dug in the same churchyard, under the same trees. And then someone else stepped into your place in the circle. A child, a sibling, a spouse. The work continued. Sometimes, as you knelt in the field. Under a gray sky, you might pause. Might look up and think about how many times you'd done this exact thing. Dug this exact row. Hauled this exact basket. You might feel a flicker of weariness, not from the task itself, but from an unbroken sameness of it all. And then you'd stand up, stretch your back, and keep going. because in a medieval village, the year didn't move forward, it turned. Like a mill wheel, like the hands of the clock you didn't have, around and around, and you followed because there was no other path. Only the circle, only the work. Again and again, Dot, in a medieval village, the idea of leaving was like the idea of flying technically. Not impossible, but strange, risky, and best left to saints or madmen. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The roads out were rough. The world beyond was worse. And even if you had the courage to go, there was no guarantee you'd ever come back, or that you'd survive long enough to wish you hadn't tried. Leaving the village wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged either. The village was your home, your network, your shield. It was where your family lived, where the fields you farmed were located, where your reputation had been painstakingly built or inherited. To leave meant to untether yourself from everything familiar, and in a society built entirely on interdependence, that was a terrifying thing to do. Most peasants were bound to the land, not enslaved, exactly, but not free either. If you were a serf, your labor belonged to the lord of the manor. You could technically walk away, but doing so would mean breaking your legal and social obligations. The Lord could fine you, punish your family, or send someone to bring you back. You could seek freedom in another town, but you'd need to stay hidden long enough to gain protection. In some places, if a runaway serf lived a year and a day in a city, they could become legally free. But surviving that long without coin, shelter, or allies, that was another matter entirely. Then there were the practical dangers. The roads weren't empty ribbons of safe passage, they were wild. Winding paths full of real threats. Bandits, wolves, disease, hunger. You might get robbed for the tunic on your back, or simply vanish into the woods, never to be seen again. There were no maps, no signposts, no GPS telling you where the next village was. You asked someone if you found someone and hoped they were telling the truth, and the towns, if you reached them, were not the shining lights of opportunity you might hope for. They were crowded, loud, disease-ridden, and expensive. Guilds controlled all skilled labor. Lodging was costly. Work was scarce. Begging was common, and being an outsider made you an easy mark. You spoke a different dialect. You dressed differently. You looked like a peasant, and people noticed. Many who left their villages ended up in worse conditions. They were called wanderers, beggars, rootless souls drifting from place to place, often with tattered clothes and sunken eyes. They might be treated with suspicion or outright hostility. Some were accused of theft just for asking for bread. Some were beaten. Others were taken in by the church or a kind-hearted miller. But those cases were rare and temporary. You might find work as a day laborer, a farmhand, a cook, or a cleaner, but it would be hard, inconsistent, and dangerous. There was no job security, no guarantee of shelter, no one to advocate for you if you were mistreated. If you got sick or injured, you had no village to return to. You were alone in every way that mattered. Even the church, often seen as a refuge, could be close to you. Monasteries weren't homeless shelters. Monks and nuns lived by strict rules, and unless you were joining them, they weren't obligated to house or feed you. Pilgrimages were one exception. If you had a holy reason to travel, some doors might open. But even then, pilgrims were often mistaken for vagrants unless they carried signs of status, like tokens or papers of protection. But say you were one of the rare few who left successfully. You made it to a town, learned a trade, earned some coin. You might still regret it, because the village, for all its hardship, was also your identity. In the town, no one knew who you were. Your grandfather's name meant nothing. Your struggles weren't understood. People didn't trust you easily. And there was no one to help you patch a leaking roof, no one to lend a scythe or care for your animals while you were ill. You were free, but utterly vulnerable. And then there was this psychological weight. Medieval people believed deeply in order divine, social, and cosmic. Leaving your station, especially without permission or cause, was seen as dangerous, even sinful. You weren't just stepping outside the village, you were stepping out of alignment with the entire worldview that held society together that the village priest might preach about such things, warning against pride, ambition, or the dangers of the open road. Tales circulated to those who left and came back changed, or didn't come back at all. Stories about villages that refused to take back those who returned in shame. About travelers who were cursed for turning away from their home and duties, and so most people stayed. Not because they were afraid, though many were, but because they understood something. And that the village, for all its mud and monotony and meddling neighbors, was their structure, their safety, their world. That even those who dreamed of escape often confined those dreams to stories, tales of saints who journeyed, of knights who ventured, of princesses who fled. Those weren't real life. Those were myths, prayers. The village was the real story, and it was told in a loop from one generation to the next dot, because when you grow up in a place where everyone knows your name, your field, your sins, and your worth leaving isn't just walking away, it's erasing yourself. And most people, even if they sometimes longed for the horizon, chose instead to stay within the hedgerows. The church bells and the familiar voices of home dot in a medieval village, you could leave. But if you truly left, you'd probably regret it for all its filth. Its fear and its fatigue. Life in a medieval village was held together by something deeper than just necessity. Beneath the mud and gossip, beneath the endless repetition and the dull ache of survival, there was a quiet strength, one so common it went unnoticed, one so ordinary that history rarely bothered to mention it. But it was there. It was always there, and it is perhaps the most remarkable part of all, that people endured. That you endured, not with grand declarations, not with heroism or fame, but with small, stubborn acts of perseverance. Day after day, season after season, generation after generation. You didn't rise to glory, but you rose in the morning. You didn't conquer kingdoms, but you conquered the chores. You didn't change the world, but you fed it, patched it, raised it, mended it, prayed for it, and carried it forward. History books don't record the names of people like you. Not often. The chroniclers focused on kings, bishops, battles, and plagues. Not the woman who walked barefoot each day to the well. Not the old man who mended shoes with trembling fingers. Not the child who watched their sibling die in silence and still went to gather eggs the next morning. But your life mattered. Because without you, nothing else worked. The noble's estate didn't feed itself. The priest didn't bake his own bread. The roads weren't cleared by knights. It was you and people like you who kept the wheel turning. Not for fame, not for glory, but because it had to be done. You endured hunger, not dramatic, heroic starvation, but the dull daily knowledge that the meal might not stretch. You endured cold patching a cloak one more time, huddling near the fire that barely reached your toes. You endured sickness, not with medicine and recovery, but with prayers and herbs, and the understanding that sometimes you simply had to outlast it. You endured grief, quiet, layered grief, for the child who didn't make it through the winter, for the sister who died in childbirth, for the neighbor lost to fever. And you didn't crumble. You mourned, you wept, and then you returned to the fields, the hearth, the rhythm, because that's what life demanded. You endured sameness, the same path to the same field, the same bowl of porridge, the same gossip, the same burdens, and yet you found ways to smile. At the turning leaves, at the way the goats bleated when they were excited, at the bad singing during the village feast. You laughed, sometimes. You danced when you could. You found joy, even if it was brief. You endured loneliness. Even surrounded by others, life could feel solitary, especially when grief came, especially when the world seemed heavy. But still you went on. Still you did your work, said your prayers, and listened to the wind move through the trees like a hymn only you could hear. You endured injustice. You paid taxes to a lord who didn't know your name. You gave up your crops to tithe you barely understood. You followed rules that weren't fair, systems that kept you low. And yet, you didn't fall into bitterness. You shared what you had with your neighbors. You helped others in times of need, knowing they would help you when your time came. And still, you loved. Quietly, practically, with no sonnets or serenades, but love all the same. You kissed your child's scraped knees. You waited for your husband to come back from the mill. You held your mother's hand when she was dying. You made sacrifices for people who would never know. You bore burdens so they wouldn't have to. And you built things, not palaces, not cathedrals, but homes. Simple, smoky, crooked homes that kept out just enough rain to sleep. You built families, communities, rituals, shared ways of being. You built the unspoken understandings that allowed people to live together, how to show respect, how to ask for help, how to mourn. The world forgot your name. But the world used everything you made, every field you cleared, every road you tread, every child you raised. The fabric of the past is woven with your labor, your patience, your strength, and your legacy. It isn't in stone. It isn't carved into monuments. It's in the lives that followed. The grandchild who remembered your stories. The village tradition that came from your habit. The field that still grows food. The lane still walked. The lullaby that once soothed a crying infant. Now a whisper in some distant descendant's voice. You didn't need to be great. You were good. And that was enough. Because in a world that didn't give you rest, you endured. In a world that asked for everything. You gave what you could. And in a world that forgot your name, your quiet strength shaped the foundation of history. And that truly is the most boring and beautiful thing of all.